Good day to you. Welcome back. And this is episode 7. And after a very interesting episode on flat Earth and the mind of a flat earther and the reality that we might be in and might not be in, definitely got a lot of you talking, a lot of you messaging me. So yeah, it's not flat. Who knows? But yeah, this episode is, well, this is by far one of the best episodes I've done. It was like a DMT trip in itself, and I haven't done that too often either. So it was, really enlightening, really informational. Definitely one you're going to have to watch and listen to maybe a few times. And it's with a philosopher of the mind and psychedelics called Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. And he's at the University of Exeter. He's written a book on metaphysics and psychedelics. I think he's even a Marvel character, which I had a little look into. And he's also done a TED Talks, which is really good, on consciousness and psychedelics. And it was just fascinating to, if you've been listening since season 1 and season 2, you know how much I talk about Alan Watts, and even my tortoise called Alan Watts. So to get the chance to talk to a philosopher of the day was great, and it's a memory I'll be looking back on for many years. And hopefully I can have another hour session with him later down the road when I've got a new question on reality to ask, I suppose. But yeah, I'll leave all the links for Dr. Peter in the below section on Spotify and YouTube and everything else for you to see. He's got a great website as well. You can look at the writings he's done, press, media, certain videos as well, panpsychism, social media stuff. So yeah, it's great, and I hope you enjoy it. And again, that Patreon, these mugs, they're coming. If you can do a little donation just on a monthly basis, that'd be fantastic as well. But yeah, and please subscribe on YouTube. If I can get that up to 1,000, then I'll be able to monetize. The last video and the videos I've had nearly clocked up to 1,000 watch hours, and I only need 4,000. So, we can all be Buddhas, but even Buddhas need money. And, I can't grow much veg in the winter either. So, I'm eating the cow, and Alan's looking at me like it's his. So, but right, listen to this one, enjoy, and welcome a mind blow. That's all I'm saying. Peace.
It's like they've really spun a web. Our consciousness,
I can't describe how it
is slightly false.
To me, it's a slightly darker version.
Because there is a...
But I could look into my...
collective consciousness.
Imagination.
Truth is what real reality is based on.
Art in a cage as well.
Oh my crazy. Yeah.
Your art is there.
Just because you say it's like that doesn't mean I'm going to read it like that.
They still don't know where consciousness is. So when I'm meditating... Yeah, I bet you do.
It's basically your heart.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so Peter, welcome to the shed. And just to kind of start off, so my listeners and myself have a bit of understanding about you and philosophy and the mind, or philosopher of the mind and psychedelics. I'm assuming that it did start in that order. So if we maybe start with where it started for you for philosophy and the mind, and then move into psychedelics.
Yeah. All right. Well, I was in London. I was teaching over 10 years ago now, philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion and other types of philosophy, epistemology, and so on. And 10 years ago, so I was quite atheistic, materialistic, I suppose. And I was roped into teaching philosophy of religion, which wasn't really my thing, but I said, okay, sure. And part of that was proofs for God and proofs for the sort of spiritual realm or metaphysical realm. And one of them was William James, and speaking about mystical experiences and whether that proved anything or not. But when he spoke about them, he spoke about them in terms of being induced by, like, what we today call psychedelics, nitrous oxide and so on.
Yeah.
In his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902. So that intrigued me because I'd never had such an experience before. And then one day I was sort of walking around my local village here in Cornwall, and my brother said, Peter, I think these are magic mushrooms. So we picked a load. I checked later that they were safe, that they're the right ones. And then I took a load and had such an amazing experience that I don't want to go into that again, but it was such an overwhelming experience that I suddenly thought, well, right, I need to read about this and study this and experience it again and so on. And then I looked at the philosophy of mind, all the literature there, and there's very little on it. And philosophy of religion, there's little on it as well. I mean, there's mystical experiences, of course, but they're always tied up with very religious interpretations. There were some books, like William James, of course, as I mentioned, and as I've realized later on, people like H.H. Price, Gerald Hurd, and so on, Merleau-Ponty even, but relatively little. So then I thought, okay, I need to do a bit more research, and I started writing about it, and that's what sort of triggered. That's how I got into it, really. So yeah, first of all, it was philosophy of mind, and I mean, I've always been interested in mind consciousness.
Yeah.
And so these substances sort of allow for an expansion of that, and that's why they were so fascinating.
Yeah.
But of course, the reason I think they were not in academia was multiple reasons. One was, of course, they were criminalized and seen as recreational and so on, and there's religious reasons against their kind of use as well. So for a number of reasons, they were suppressed, and that's why it's kind of a new field now.
Yeah. Because I heard they used to actually be called conscious charging drugs, but I'm not sure how much that is true or not.
Well, I know there's a number of names for them. I haven't actually come across that, but they used to be called, like Fantastica, psychomimetics, entheogens later on, like engendering God inside.
I think it was Terence McKenna that said conscious charging. I think he said something like that.
Right. Yeah, well, you see, Terence McKenna is one of these things I got to afterwards as well. He's sort of not in the normal philosophical canon, but he's a very broad thinker. But anyway, and hallucinogen, of course, is another word for it. And all of these words have got issues, like problems, because they all they're not neutral, a lot of them. So like hallucinogen obviously means that you only hallucinate when you take it. Entheogen means that it generates God within. So that's not that applicable to, atheists and so on. And Fantastica, of course, indicates illusion. So even the word psychedelic is kind of like, we have discussed this because it has connotations to, the hippie movement in the 60s and so on. But I think still psychedelic is the best word. And it's very interesting when you read about who coined that. It was the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, who was friends of Aldous Huxley, and he had this sort of correspondence with Huxley where they were talking about coming up with a new name for these type of substances. And Huxley had one idea, Osmond had this other one. In correspondence 1956-57, he published a paper on it where he coined the term psychedelic for the first time, meaning mind manifesting. But the interesting thing about that paper is it's very broad, it's very inclusive. It includes a lot of drugs that sometimes are considered not psychedelics, such as nitrous oxide. It's like Humphrey Osmond includes it within that paper in reference to William James, actually.
Yeah.
So it's still a very important paper. And also in that paper, he makes a lot of links to philosophy. And in a later paper in the 70s, he writes about, directly the philosophical implications of psychedelics. So right from the start, even though he was a psychiatrist, there were philosophical he always sort of said, this must be pursued further. And he makes reference to John Smithies, another friend of theirs, philosopher, Huxley, of course, H.H. Price and others. And so right from the start of the word psychedelic, you have immediate references to philosophy and philosophers. Yet it didn't really take that path, not much anyway. It went into psychiatry
Yeah.
stayed there, and now the Renaissance, we see it's still there.
Yeah, because I think for a lot of people, psychedelic is quite a scary word. And I feel the words you use, like hallucination, they kind of have an essence of they're not real. It's a step away from reality, whereas maybe it might be broadening your reality. And I feel like the language that's used a lot of the time is definitely the wrong language in those terms. But until you start to understand it more, then it changes your perspective of what the word means, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess so. And the language kind of primes you for the experience in a way. So it is quite important, really.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't use the word hallucinogen, and I don't use the word entheogen, just because they're loaded terms. Psychedelic, I think, is quite nice and neutral.
Yeah. And I mean, with these, I've heard some of your podcasts before, or ones you've done before. You spoke about, I think it was Humphrey Davies. Was he the one that went in? He done nitrous oxide, or what? There was one that went into a chamber. I heard you discuss.
Yeah, that was Humphrey Davies.
Yeah.
He actually, here's a plug. My new book, Modes of Sentience, there's a chapter on Humphrey Davies' nitrous oxide therein, and the links to philosophy. But yeah, no, Humphrey Davies lived 7 miles away in Penzance here in Cornwall. Yeah. He was raised here, brought up here. And but he went to Bristol and tried a number of gases, including carbon monoxide. But he tried, he became most enamored to nitrous oxide. He took, as you say, in this kind of airtight box, chamber, whatever you want to call it, 200 pints, 160 pints of nitrous oxide in there, and then took 40 pints as he got out. So a high dose. And after that, he said, nothing exists but thoughts. So he's reflecting there the sort of Kantian idealism that he was reading at the time with his friends Wordsworth and Southey and Coleridge and so on. So there's an interesting link again with that was the first kind of Western, certainly the first major scientific experimental look into psychedelics in the West. And immediately, again, it starts with philosophy. The first thing he says is an expression of idealism, which means that matter is not real, but the mind projects matter. The mind is the main substance of the universe. Yeah. And idealism didn't really become popular in academic philosophy until about 70 years after that. I mean, he said that in 1799, and only in the sort of 1870s did the British idealists emerge, who were sort of influenced by Kant, more Hegel, really. Yeah. So again, the origins of psychedelics there's a strong association with philosophy that was lost.
It seems like people, like Plato or a lot of these philosophers seem to like the drugs and seem to. I mean, I think drugs is also the wrong word for it as well. I mean, I think they're more healers, or in a way, the conscious expanding of the mind comes from these psychedelics. So I think drugs is the bad word that I'll try to stop using through this hour. But,
drugs is an awkward word, isn't it? Because in British English, it's got different connotations to American English, where you have like drugstore. You don't have that in Britain.
Yeah, so exactly.
It's got a more criminal connotation here in Britain. I think, it's just too general a word. I mean, it can mean medicine,
of course,
legal drugs, psychedelics. So better just more specific.
So is your study? I mean, you picked those mushrooms and realised they were the right ones. Did that sort of spawn into all psychedelics, or is it mainly a specialty of mushrooms, or do you go as far as DMT, or different nitrous oxide in a chamber? Or
I've never tried 200 pints of nitrous oxide, not yet.
No, I wouldn't recommend it.
No. But no, it's a full range, really. I mean, the most extreme experience is 5-MeO DMT. That's different league, really, and very different from mushrooms.
Is that like the toad, or?
It comes from the Sonoran Desert toad, but it can be synthesized as well. So it's better that way, really. It doesn't, because those toads are somewhat in danger. But yeah, it's a very different experience. It's first of all, it's not perceptual, not visual, like mushrooms are. Except for an initial white light, with a slight fascination in it. It's just you lose your perception, you lose your vision, hearing,
Yeah.
all forms of perception. You lose your memory, you lose your concepts, your thinking ability. And it almost sounds, when you describe it, that you lose consciousness. But the funny thing is, it's the precise opposite.
Yeah.
It's like an extreme form of profundity, which is not sensible, as we say in philosophy, not sensational, doesn't come from the senses, and it's not introspective either. You can't think, as I say, but nonetheless, it's excessive. So, I mean, yeah, and even then you call that a psychedelic, but I mean, how that differs from other psychedelics is quite profound as well. So,
Yeah.
But I speak about that, the phenomenology of that, in other words, the study of the experience of that, in another essay coming out soon in our Bloomsbury book, Philosophy and Psychedelics, an edited volume, where I talk about that in relation to Spinoza's.
Yeah. It sounds similar to like the ayahuasca trips or DMT, but the only person I know that's actually done or spoke about that, or I've probably done a bit too minimal research, but was Mike Tyson that's done the toad. And I think Mike Tyson is probably the only person that the psychedelic substance might be actually scared of in that situation.
Yeah, that's an equal fact, isn't it?
But he was talking in the terms that you were expressing just then as well. And is this practical or just theory with that DMT for you? Or
I mean, my general approach to psychedelics is quite theoretical, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not. Luckily, I don't think I do need healing or anything like this. So it's purely abstract, theoretical. But of course, not just theoretical. I mean, it's the experience itself, which is so moving, and it does change you. It has. I mean, like 5-MeO is sort of, I'm still processing that.
Yeah.
I took it in a legal country, blah blah blah. But I'm still. It's so powerful.
Yeah.
Emotion. Although it's I actually took it for theoretical reasons to compare it to Spinozism. But yeah, it has an effect upon you, which you can only call emotional in a way. The experience itself wasn't really emotional unless you consider profundity an emotion. Yeah. But that's why I looked into it. But it's. I hardly dare to take it again, to be honest. Although I know someone who takes it every Sunday, a farmer around here. So.
Does he do much on Mondays? Terence McKenna actually said when speaking about DMT in a group, he would ask people, when they last took it, or what they found most amazing about DMT, and they would usually say, "Oh, it was great," and he would ask when they took it, and it would be like the 2000s or 1990, and they were like, "Yeah, I took it 10 years ago," because he's like, it's so much to kind of process that what has happened through that motion that they don't need to. It's not excessive or needed again. It's the fact that I just need to kind of understand what I just went through for a very long period. So. Well,
that's why I think it's interesting to bring in the philosophy, and partly why I did it is we had some people from Imperial College come to Exeter University last week or a couple of weeks ago, and they talk about they're doing actually a new study on trying to discover the neural correlates of 5-MeO DMT. That hasn't been mapped properly yet.
What is a neurocorrelate?
Neural correlate is so when it's believed that when you have an experience, let's say of happiness, there is a correlated brain activity going on there. That's the neural correlate of the experience. So when you have 5-MeO DMT, people basically do not know what's going on in the brain. So they're doing experiments to decipher that soon, or new experiments. But the interesting thing is they talk about, some people have bad trips, and they talk about the need to integrate that. And my question was, how do you really integrate such a profound experience that can change you and gives you new insights, or at least new emotions, or new cognition somehow? And they're like, oh, well, we don't really know how to do that. We trained psychologists do it. But I mean, the interesting thing for me is, do these experiences somehow, are they just hallucinations, or do they somehow yield some kind of veridical, like real truth out? William James, for example, said they did seemingly yield a truth. He called it a noetic quality, or at least the sense that it was a truth. And that is knowable. What would that truth be? So for example, if you have an experience of non-temporality, like you lose time, but you still can experience.
Yeah.
Does that have to be a hallucination? Well, it is a hallucination if you believe that time is the condition for experience and time is fundamentally real. But it doesn't have to be a hallucination if you believe that time is not real and not a condition of experience. And then, so then you can look at certain metaphysical theories which say that time is really an illusion, you know, or it's like our human way of looking at the world. So when you bring in metaphysics, you can then realize that you don't have to rule out these experiences as kind of trivial and hallucinatory, but they might have some kind of, they might provide some form of insight into reality that normal consciousness doesn't provide.
Yeah.
Because obviously we've evolved our consciousness and our perception as part of that in terms of practical use. You know, what has been a practical benefit to mankind throughout, and all animals for that matter, through the years. But that means we exclude a lot. You know, I mean, we know very basically that we can't see, you know, most frequencies of electromagnetism. You know, the light, the colors you see is just a small, you know, small little dent in that, really. So we know that we don't see reality as it is, and thus do psychedelics allow for a bit more of that. This is Huxley's, you know, theory in laws of perception, which he gets from Bergson, Henri Bergson, the philosopher.
Yeah.
So these are the interesting, I mean, so there's interesting questions in philosophy of mind, what consciousness is, what the neural correlates thereof are, but also there's very interesting questions in terms of metaphysics, how we can make sense of these things, possibly, and also how that might help to integrate certain experiences into some kind of more general metaphysical framework that, you know, just a clinical trial would not provide.
And are there, I mean, not with DMT, but I know there are clinical trials. I saw one. I think I saw one with David Nutt. I think you've spoken to him as well. I think it was actually on the BBC, and they done one with mushrooms. It was people that were highly addicted to antidepressants, or they couldn't wean off of them, and they done 2 sessions on mushrooms, I think it was, and after that they were like, well, we don't need them anymore. But are there many with, I know there's sort of MDMA with PTSD. They're doing a lot in the States, like Denver, Colorado have obviously legalized mushroom there. Do you think in the UK we're much further away from that kind of examination, that your philosophical mind could also combine that with how it can be put into the system where it could be more of a medical basis and under controlled environments to help people in these conditions?
Yeah, well, I mean, the United States, who really led the war on drugs, are now sort of going
the other
way against it again in a way, and that's partly because of the way that states are kind of independent from federal state in America.
Of course, yeah.
They've got more like sort of grassroots impact than we have in Britain. It's very top down, you know, Parliament sort of everything comes from above. However, Boris Johnson, our great leader, he did say a few weeks ago in the House of Commons that he would consider psilocybin, you know, the magic mushroom ingredient. He would consider legalizing that. I did see that. Clinical use only, he says. So that's, you know, one step in that direction. But you know, there's a danger that, I mean, like, so there's 2 arguments here. One is that, well, first of all, I would say that the war on drugs and the sort of criminalization of drugs is kind of not logical, not scientific. Like David Nutt had a paper on this 10 years ago, and it's kind of been proved that magic mushrooms are really not harmful for you. You can have bad trips, of course, but psychological, not physical. So the drug laws don't really make sense, whereas, you know, like alcohol and cigarettes are harmful for you but are legal. So there's that inconsistency. And then you look at the history of the war on drugs and you realize it's partly based on, you know, racism and so on.
Yeah.
So you think that these laws should be changed. So the next step is you think, well, how can one get people to be on the side of that change? Because of course politicians will only change things if they get votes, if they don't want to lose voters, rather. So one way of doing that is to offer the therapeutic use of these things, and that's what's going on now. That's really the main aspect of the so-called psychedelic renaissance now. We see that actually, as opposed to them, that, you know, LSD frying your brain, is actually quite the contrary, is quite therapeutic. And who can be against therapy? But then there's another aspect, which is the danger that the only use of psychedelics will be in the clinical establishment, the pharmaceutical establishment. So people could still go to jail for using it recreationally or academically or whatever it may be. But, and of course, it is in the interests to a certain extent for pharmaceutical companies to keep psychedelics illegal, because then they have complete monopoly on their use. So there's this interesting conflict now between medicalization and legalization. And so but then some people argue that, well, they don't have, that doesn't have to be in conflict. You know, you could start using it clinically, and then that will lead to the general decriminalization of it or legalization of it. So it's we're in the midst of that at the moment. There's a lot of players. I mean, there's the psychiatrists, clinicians. There's also then the pharmaceutical companies, the massive investors, so on and so forth. And so that renaissance in itself, interestingly, brings about a lot of ethical questions. That philosophy can sort of meet, ethical questions, really, as well as questions about, appropriating use from indigenous peoples and so on. So it's a really fascinating field at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if it went into that setting, I think the setting that shrooms, even that word shrooms, is like it can be put in the wrong setting. A bad trip. Some people that have gone through a bad trip or that's happened to them, they might not necessarily think it's a bad trip after. Like, if it's in the right setting and they have a bad trip, like they're in a peaceful environment, everything else, maybe that's something that. I'm not sure on the technicalities, but maybe it's something that needs to come out of you. But I think where these bad trips can happen, I mean, with psychedelics, I think you're processing a lot of data. And if you're in, say, a festival environment or somewhere that's really busy, people can just freak out because it can be too much. So I think if it does go into a clinical setting and one like that was on the BBC, laying there in a room with your eyes closed with a therapist, I think if that's the way it's going to start, that might start it in the right direction in order for people to get what it's actually meant to do, I think, maybe. But then there's still a good thing of just doing them and walking around the woods.
Yeah, and then there's, of course, the question of, the political question of cognitive liberty, and whether the state has the right to control the way you want to experience life. Especially if it's not harmful to others. There's something that Charlotte Walsh talks a lot about, for example. This becomes a political question then, extent of the power of the state. And this, ultimately, I think there's no absolute answer to these questions. It's just there are different political setups that will have different values here. But as far as I'm concerned, my own personal interest is that I think that at the very least, people shouldn't be put in prison for taking these things. That it seems to be completely unjust. Just radical, extreme power play.
When cigarettes are sold.
Reminds me of this book by Lee Fielding, who was part of like the biggest LSD distribution group in the 70s in Britain. There was this police operation called Operation Julie, who sort of cracked down on them, and they all ended up in jail in Bristol, or some of them in Bristol at least. And this Lee Fielding, he said, whilst they were locked up years for distributing LSD, the police all celebrated in the pub, like getting drunk with alcohol, and that's just sort of typical exemplification of the inconsistency of drug laws in this country, in most countries, actually.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at you only have to look at the the numbers really on the amount of money alcohol costs the NHS, or how many people die a year from alcohol and cigarettes, to how many people have died from psychedelics in decades. It's very different. So
but of course that's not to say that we should ban alcohol and cigarettes.
No,
either.
but there should be choice. There should be choice.
Well, it seems that way.
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's dependent on your political stance.
Mm-hmm. And I think also what was great about what you're doing is bringing obviously a meeting of the minds to psychedelics. If the knowledge can be pushed towards people understanding that they're not this this crazy substance that sends you doolally, they can actually really help. Once that message is spread more, then we do have things like Boris saying, okay, let's go with it.
Yeah, well, interestingly, until the 60s, really, psychedelics were in the hands of philosophers and artists, mostly poets, Baudelaire, people like that, William James, Price, and so on. But it was really the 60s and then the 70s that started off this whole new, quite new perspective on these psychoactive drugs.
Yeah.
Of course, before that, there was, in America, there was prohibition of alcohol, of course, in the early 20th century. And before that, the Roman Catholics who came to the Americas considered their psychoactive drug use as satanic. So there has been a Christian kind of crusade, as it were, against a lot of psychoactive drugs. That is still with us. We still feel the legacy of that. That was a factor in the war against drugs, certainly affecting the laws we have here as a consequence. And one still sees it. I think one of many reasons, is that it was considered a form of I don't like the word spirituality, but a form of exceptional experience that was not mediated by the church in any way. And thus it sort of brought people to a more metaphysical viewpoint, which was not necessarily Christian. Of course, that was that made the church. So they considered it satanic, first of all. So it was. Yeah. It was kind of metaphysical, but in a bad way. And we're still with that. Plus the Puritanism of the Protestant Christians as well, of course. So yes, there's so many factors which contribute to where we are today with these laws and people's approach to them.
Which happened quite a long time ago as well, through many, many, many years. So it's hard to get back round.
And then, of course, as you've intimated with Plato, in ancient Greece, there was, Dionysian festivals. There was the famous Eleusinian mysteries, whereby people probably took some kind of psychoactive potion, the kykeon, whatever it may be. Even the wine there in ancient Greece was psychoactive, so it's hard to avoid it. Henry Bergson speaks about Orphism, the religion of Orphism. You're sort of incorporating that. And recently we've seen, Jewish temples even having cannabis resin and so on found within their walls. So, drug use is nothing new. And it is it was in ancient Greece at the start. Plato speaks about, it's got certain trips, let's say. It doesn't say necessarily they were caused by in the Eleusinian mysteries, but talks about this vision of the train of Zeus and these apparitions and the great light and so on. Yeah. And he says he wants to be counted as one amongst the mystics and so on. So there was certainly some kind of influence of this exceptional experience on the philosophers of ancient Greece. Bergson says starting with Pythagoras, probably, actually, and then that influencing Plato to some extent.
Yeah.
But these, one can only speculate, really. There's no absolute proof of this.
Yes, it is definitely a speculation, but it's good to know at the same time that maybe they was finding out a lot more through doing this, hopefully through their magic potions and their magic wine.
and probably inspired them a lot. For example, in Plato's book on the soul, the Phaedo, first of all, he says he wants to be counted amongst the mystics, and then for the first time he argues for which he is famous for, which is dualism, that the mind and soul, or rather, the soul and the body are distinct substances, and the soul can leave the body. And one wonders if, these mystical experiences really were the trigger of that. In other words, some kind of disembodied experience might have then led to the sort of, rational philosophy that tried to establish the truth of that.
Yeah. I think I heard as well, stepping away a little bit from substances, but still maybe possibly getting to these states without a substance. The Greeks used to say something, I think it was around, it's literally one of the only things I haven't put in my notes, but it was it's to do with the claustrum in the brain, like Santa Claustrum. Have you heard of that? So it's like that a sacred oil. They would call it the fire of the gods, I think. So you're going to sort of the Kundalini effect, the energy coming from the root chakra all the way to the claustrum. And I think it was the Greeks that would speak about that, the sacred, or if you sustain from the guilty pleasures of life or earthly delights, then after 30 days this oil will drop from the claustrum in the brain. But I heard of that. I'll have to maybe ping you over some stuff and see if you're like, this is just internet nonsense. But I mean, going back to where I actually first saw you, it was the festival of how the light gets in, and the talk, the panel I saw you on, I think it was the oldest gods.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I wrote quite a lot of notes about what you was speaking about. One thing that interested me the most was that you said nature is vulnerable, and we need to return back to source. So, like within that, do you feel what made me sort of react to when you say that was that, and I didn't know that you was a philosopher of the mind and psychedelics, but then after that I started thinking, okay, and my question to that is, do you think that with the use of psychedelics, it does change the kind of constrictions of consciousness, such as cultural appropriation or religious views, to more of an open mind to what reality actually is, rather than the constructs of what we've been sort of built into?
Well, yeah, if there's a deep question, really. Where shall I start? There was this paper recently came out, authored by Chris Timmerman and some others, where he said it's supposed to be a scientific study whereby it showed that people who had taken psychedelics did, on the whole, shift their metaphysical belief systems.
Yeah.
The general trend was away from physicalism. Physicalism is the view that only matter is fundamentally real. Everything comes out of that, like the mind, time, space, everything. But that paper it's got a lot of problems with it, to be honest. The methodology was a bit dodgy, and also it didn't even have some prime metaphysical views like pantheism or monism. And pantheism I was speaking about in that panel you spoke about, Spinozism. But nonetheless, I do think, I think I would have predicted that psychedelic experiences can change your metaphysical views, at the very least make you question them, at the very least. I mean, I've got a lot of anecdotal evidence for that, but a proper study still needs to be made, if it's even possible. I don't like a lot of these studies based on email surveys, I just don't think that gets you very far. But a lot of the science is based on nothing. But nonetheless, I do believe that they can have an effect on your views in terms of nature. So in that talk, I was speaking about I was sort of taking a Spinozist position, which generally means this. Spinoza said that God is nature itself, so they were the same thing: God, nature, substance. And I was arguing how this was important because ethical theories up until the 20th century really didn't take nature to be a vulnerable parameter, just considered nature to be an absolute in the background. Hans Jonas wrote this essay in the 1970s, saying, all ethical theories hitherto haven't taken nature as sacred, and thus they've led to the sort of ecological crisis we're now facing. So psychedelics, I think they, this is actually the research I'm beginning to look at now. There are these other scientific, inverted commas, papers saying that psychedelics can induce nature connectedness, like a greater affiliation to nature, however you define nature. And this is quite interesting. I mean, again, I've got problems with like the way that certain scientists think they prove things, but nonetheless, again, let's say you do have an experience on a psychedelic and you feel like you've somehow felt the kind of mind of a plant, right? Something like this is quite common, or a tree in a forest or something. Now, how you interpret that is very much based on your metaphysical beliefs in the first place. So the common scientific metaphysical belief today is physicalism, really, that which means that such a intuition or psychedelics has to be a hallucination, because the plant itself cannot have any form of sentience, because a brain is a necessary condition for sentience, for consciousness. However, if you look at Spinozism, he says that all matter has mind, essentially. It's what he calls parallelism. So if you accept that, then an experience whereby you sort of become, you feel like you sense kind of values within nature becomes more plausible. Like, well, at the very least, it doesn't mean that it must be hallucination. And I think there's very good reasons for holding a Spinozist view, or at least a modern form of it. And you realize why it's not held if you look at history, and you realize why it was suppressed by the church and so on, and by the synagogue. And I can talk about that if you like. But anyway, there's good logical reasons for believing in sentience of plants and other things. And this makes, interestingly, this then you can relate to psychedelic experiences of nature connectedness.
Yeah. Have you seen the documentary Fantastic Fungi?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is it Paul Statesman? Paul Statesman? Stamets, that's it. He, I mean, it's a fascinating documentary, but they're talking of how, you know, you need the brain to be sentient, and that when it's with mushrooms, it's actually the mycelium, isn't it, that's underneath, that is like the connective web. And I've always thought that it's like, you know, if a tree dies over there, they must be like, come on, there's one over here, and then all the fungi goes over there, you know, underneath. That's like their matrix, their web of where they must be communicating through the roots of other dead animals or dead trees or anything else that might be on the ground. But I think there is definitely an understanding between mushrooms underneath the ground, I think, but that's just a speculation, I would say, on my point.
Well, yeah, Paul Stamets, I remember reading a book a few years ago. He said, you know, the mycelia, which are basically the roots of mushrooms,
yes,
they are very similar to neural nets in the brain.
Yes.
You know, they're interconnected cells, and they react to the environment and so on. And he thinks, you know, they're essentially akin to a brain, therefore sentient. I mean, that's still assuming that you need something like a brain to be sentient, which I question in itself. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, like, for example, if you believe that robots or computers could be sentient, you don't need this kind of thing. You need something analogous to it, some kind of self-systematic unity. That's the important thing. But yeah, so of course, people will say, yeah, but, you know, there's no need for this, you know, mycelia to actually be conscious. They do everything they do without any requirement for consciousness. Like, what's the point of adding consciousness? The problem with that argument, of course, you can apply it to a human as well. You know, we can trace all our actions to our nerve system and muscles and whatnot, you know, we don't need consciousness. But of course we know, and this is the first thing we know really, that we are conscious or sentient. And therefore one has to, you know, understand that there was a certain interesting relationship between sentience and matter, and we can't simply assume that we need a brain to have sentience. This can't be proved, you know, that you need a brain to be sentient for a number of reasons. You can't actually empirically show that. You can't even show that brains, well, you can't show it's necessary or sufficient for consciousness. There may be other factors involved of which we're unaware. But this has been a kind of general Western belief for the last couple of hundred years, and that's mostly due to Descartes' philosophy, really, where he separated the soul from the body, and so then the body or matter was left as completely insentient. I mean, Descartes was extreme. He thought even other animals weren't sentient, you know, dogs. Yeah. And so what happened historically is that the church then took the soul and you know, spoke about that, and that was left to the religious department, as it were. Science took matter as extension, as geometrical to start with, and left the soul to religion. But then, of course, later on, you know, in the 20th century, science basically didn't believe in consciousness, like through behaviorism and so on, eliminativism. But in the late 20th century, you know, there was a kind of acknowledgement that, okay, we have to accept that this is real. And it shows the absurdities of science and fads and fashions therein, you know. And so now there's like this great, you know, search for the neural correlates of consciousness and so on. But there are so many problems with that in terms of like emergence, like how mind can emerge from matter in terms of mental causation, in terms of epiphenomenalism, blah, blah, blah. I can bore you with all these terms right in the philosophy of mind. But I think the key kind of split then was with Descartes. So he made this split, whereas before that with the Greeks and Aristotle, mind and matter were intertwined, you know?
Yeah.
There wasn't this great bifurcation of nature. And thus, if you think of mind and matter as intertwined in the first place, then science should never have dealt just with one abstraction of that, like it's sort of extracted matter from that intertwinement.
Yeah.
It's just working on like a part of concrete reality. And that's why it's led to all these paradoxes and cul-de-sacs and so on, you know, hard problems of consciousness, because it's treating, it's got a wrong idea of what matter is, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's why Spinoza was so great historically, because he was, as opposed to he published a book on Descartes' philosophy, but he sought to resolve it. So instead of mind and matter being two substances, he said there's only one substance, which then he called God, nature, and mind and matter are both expressions of the same thing, like you know, the morning star and the evening star, both different expressions of Venus, the one thing.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he was then, because he called God nature, he was considered an atheist, because he didn't think that the soul survived the body, although he did believe in eternal life is a different thing. He was kind of castigated, punished, and if you expressed any sort of sympathy for Spinozism 100 years after he died in 1677, you could lose your job, you know, you could lose your pension.
Yeah.
It's a very dangerous thing to say.
Yeah.
So he was suppressed, and thus science went ahead, and the Industrial Revolution and so on, by considering matter as dead and all of nature just as of instrumental nature use to us humans, which meant we had no respect for nature, and thus the Industrial Revolution, and thus you know, now the predicament we are in. So there's an interesting metaphysical basis for the ecological crisis, you know.
Yeah, I wrote one of Spinoza's quotes, which he does speak of God in this one, when he says whatever is in God, and nothing can exist or be conceived without God. So I mean, I kind of get that's all is one in a kind of sense, the way I think he's coming across with that.
Yeah, he's the ultimate monist, which basically means all is one. And mind and matter are different expressions of that one thing. God is not transcendent. He's not outside of the universe. God is the universe.
Yeah, of course.
So,
and we might be the goggles.
Well, yeah, we are one perspective on that, absolutely. Yeah. And when he says we are all in God, that means we're all in nature. You know, which who can deny this?
Yeah, of course.
The only thing is, it's not materialism either, or physicalism, because just as there's parallelism, mind and matter are parallel. Every time you have a bit of matter, there's an element of mind to it, not consciousness necessarily, but something into subconsciousness in most cases. But that means just as there is, he argues, infinite space, so there must also be infinite mind. So there is this aspect of God or nature, which he calls infinite intellect, which is like not then physicalist. It's like this overmind, this grand mind. Now he is very specific, and he said God doesn't love you. You know, it's not a sort of, it's not a consoling God. He doesn't care about you, but nonetheless, it is there. And this, interestingly, sort of led into notions in idealism. The British idealists spoke about something called eternal consciousness related to this. Yeah, and then Edward Carpenter and R.M. Buck and William James spoke about cosmic consciousness coming from this. And then, of course, 50, 60 years later, this was then like a kind of became a platitude amongst psychedelic aficionados, you know, this cosmic consciousness that Aldous Huxley spoke of as well. Yeah. But you can interestingly trace that back to Spinozism.
Yeah.
And of course, actually, before Spinoza, I mean, you can trace it back even further to like Maimonides, for example, a Jewish philosopher, and ultimately back to Aristotle's God, which he called the prime mover, which was a metaphysical principle not related to religion. So the interesting thing about Spinoza and Aristotle here is that there's a God, but there's no religion. You know, there's a sort of God without theology.
Yeah, I mean, from speaking to other people around this religion is slightly separate to even the biblical senses of things that are written when you start looking into it further. I find what are your thoughts on what? I mean, this is a very, very deep, but obviously very open speculation. But what is your kind of thoughts of what consciousness actually is on the terms of either within the mind or a non-local entity?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a classic philosophical question. What is consciousness? I mean, what I generally tend to do is, I mean, you can divide. I prefer the word number one, sentience, to consciousness, because you can often like separate consciousness from subconsciousness, right?
Yeah.
So what is the term that includes both? And I prefer therefore the word sentience.
Yeah.
Because when you say you're conscious of something,
one needs the other. Do you mean?
Well, I just mean, like, if you say you're conscious of something, doesn't mean that you don't have other things in your perception, say, but they're not in your what we call access consciousness, not at the front of your mind. So anyway, I prefer the word sentience. What does that include? I think consciousness, like being aware of something, focused on something, is like a crown of consciousness. It's a rare part of it that humans have, other animals have, but even in humans, it's not always there, like dreamless sleep, for example. And then you can divide it into separate aspects. So you have, although they're all intertwined, but you can still speak about, for example, emotions as opposed to concepts, as opposed to percepts. You can talk about memories. You talk about access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, which really is what I just said, like focus and subconscious. You can talk about the speed of time, how you consciously perceive time. Like, time can slow down in certain situations or speed up. And there's no real objective speed of time, as it were. You can speak about aesthetic aspects of consciousness and so on. So it can be broken down into a load of different components, although I would say these, when you break it down, this is for like teaching and speaking about it. Ultimately, they're very much integrated, like values and colors, as Whitehead, are kind of really intertwined in reality. But nonetheless, there's those aspects of consciousness. I sort of take the Spinozist panpsychological point of view, where I think that consciousness is not limited to the brain. I think that plants have a basic, as the Greeks did, as Plato did, for example, Greeks have a basic form of sentience. So like the appreciation of water and sunlight, for reasons of parsimony. You can't empirically prove it one way or the other. You can't prove they're conscious or non-conscious, sentient or non-sentient. So you have to then therefore go further afield and talk about inference to best explanation, like the most logical, parsimonious explanations for things. Now, I suppose there's one. That's one thing from humans down, as well, in terms of complexity. A question that I'm open-minded on and beginning to look into more and more is this notion, actually, of like the infinite intellect or cosmic consciousness. Is there an overmind of which we are parts, just like there's an overspace of which our bodies are parts, right? And could it be, again, through psychedelics, as old as Huxley sort of intimated, that we gain access to this mind at large, as he called it, from Bergson? This I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I'm open-minded to it, but
I looked at this a little bit, not to stop you short there, but just to add to it. I was looking at as in a sense of my mobile data to the iCloud, as in the information that is gathered through what I experience through my life. If there was an external consciousness, then maybe that's what it grows on, is the information and experience. If it was just on its own, it wouldn't have anything to experience to understand anything of what is actually happening. So if you look at we could all be, just the kind of goggles for that experience, for that information. And I think we are, in a way, imitating that now with things like the metaverse, or the things like how Wi-Fi works to your computer, to the software on the computer. We're all components that all need all these things to work together, as you said, like sentient. So
well, maybe. I mean, interestingly, it's related to something that Alfred North Whitehead calls a consequent nature of God, which is God experiencing himself as the universe through us, through beings, not just humans and not just beings with eyes, but all everything essentially, because he thinks everything is organic, including molecules and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is an interesting question, and it's something I mean, in philosophy and philosophy of mind, really, there's a new name for it, really, which is cosmopsychism, which is like the new name for pantheism, essentially. Like God
what
is
is pantheism again?
Pantheism is that God is everything. Everything. Yeah. And that was coined by an English mathematician called Joseph Raphson 20 years after Spinoza died, and it was named in honor of Spinoza, really, or it was named to refer to Spinoza's philosophy. So Spinoza really was the original pantheist in this sense. But actually, before that, Giordano Bruno was really, you could see him as a pantheist. And again, you go back in time, you see others, Maimonides probably just about, and so on. So and then now cosmopsychism is the latest kind of label for the same thing, really. It's a very interesting matter. Because if it were true as well, right? If we were nodes, as it were, or outlets and inputs for this mind,
nodes,
for this outer mind, it would mean that the brain is not sufficient for consciousness. Like you couldn't just have a brain on its own, disconnected. It would have to be kind of some kind of receiver, right? So that's what I mean when I say we don't know what the necessary and sufficient conditions for consciousness are, because there's still a possibility, even though it seems far-fetched. There's certainly the possibility of this infinite intellect, and if that were the case, then we would realize that is a necessary, one of many necessary causes for consciousness, which means that it just makes the whole mind matter mystery even wider, because it means that we just to really fully explain it, we need to look at these really deep kind of almost getting into theological territories.
Yeah, but through them maybe we might find more answers, I suppose. But I think it is I think when we're imitating a lot of this, if you're going really far-fetched, but simulation theories and stuff like that, if they're starting to be created in our own environment, then I suppose it only brings about that maybe it could be possible. I mean, existence itself to me is pretty crazy. Like, even if you just look at the normality of it, you're like, okay.
Really think about these big things, even looking at the starry skies, you think, what is going on here?
Yeah. I mean, to go into consciousness as well, when I was thinking about what you were saying earlier, in a way of there's direct consciousness, and then I've heard that obviously subconsciousness, but then I've heard quantum consciousness, and that is also talking about what we were just talking about, that there is a quantum consciousness. This is what some people are leading to, that there is one all around. That was the kind of word I was just looking for there, but that it's that it is non-local, and it is this stuff that you can tap into through different states of, how can I put it, like frequency. So then from what I've learned or seen is that there are people that are putting themselves into maybe a higher frequency or a higher state to access not their subconsciousness, but this quantum consciousness, which to me is like the DMT state in a way, but I think with using a substance, you might not know what's going on when you get there.
I don't know. I don't know about that quantum state, but it does remind me of, again, going back to Spinoza. He says, I mentioned that there are two attributes of substance, right, which are mind and matter.
Yeah.
He says these are the two attributes by which humans can understand nature or God. Are two access points, as it were. But he says, interestingly, there's an infinite number of other attributes of which we humans are not privy, we don't have access to. But he says all of these different other attributes, interestingly, have a corresponding mental state, which has sort of confused a lot of Spinoza scholars. But interestingly, there is sometimes hints in Spinoza that there might be methods of accessing these other ways of looking at, of understanding or conceiving or grasping substance, God, nature, which then, but then that wouldn't be a normal human way. But then, yeah, I suppose it's something I have looked at very briefly. Maybe psychedelics can allow for this complete re-imaging of reality itself. This is an interesting one because it is a different state of being, isn't it? That DMT brings you into.
Yeah.
And again, that would be, you see, the judgment whether that's a hallucination or reality is really dependent on fundamental underlying metaphysical perspectives in the first place. If you take the Spinozan metaphysic, then again it allows for exploration of the possibilities of this, which I find really interesting.
Yeah. Terence McKenna said that, I think it was around language, that he said that if you are where is it? I'll just find it so I don't quote him wrong, actually. We can move no faster than the evolution of our language, and this is certainly part of what psychedelics are about. They force the evolution of language. So, I mean, a lot of the time I hear people can't even explain, like you said, you can't explain it in emotions, in anything else. And that, to me, kind of, from someone that is like Terence McKenna or the people that have done a lot of these experiences, the farmer every Sunday might talk like this. But, it's I feel like there is another language that these states put you into. But like, what are your thoughts on like astral projection or those kind of states, or breath work with DMT breath work, those kind of things which aren't substance based? Whether the human is actually capable of doing this without extra help.
Well, first thing I'd say is, there's an interesting aspect of what's traditionally called ineffability with regard to psychedelic states. So, although William James is known for saying this, Humphrey Davies actually speaks about it. There's just certain states of existence that cannot be expressed because words, of course, are based on our general life and culture.
Yeah.
But I think that ineffability is somewhat relative to your knowledge. So, like, for example, someone who has studied, let's say, 5-dimensional space topology, if they have an experience of this, it won't be ineffable to them. They'll be able to express it, Whereas someone who has never looked into that, that would be an ineffable experience, right? So there's an element of relativity to ineffability. But some things are even far beyond that. Does that, and then of course, if a lot of people, it's possible that you could create some kind of phenomenology whereby you coin new terms for certain new experiences, so that would be an example of the sort of evolution of our language, perhaps. Although it'd be quite hard to really be sure that you've had the same experience, but I suppose that applies to real life generally. With regard to breath work, so I'm very good friends with these with the Dream Shadow holotropic breathwork group, and who based in Vermont in America, who the Gibsons, Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson, run it, and they were trained by Stan Groff himself, who basically came up with the whole holotropic breathwork method, which, to those people who don't know, is a way of breathing a special way for a while, which then occasions something akin to psychedelic experiences. So you don't need a drug. Be endogenous. And I think, of course, they are perfectly valid. I've seen it. I haven't actually tried it fully yet. But, there are methods, also meditative methods of fasting, and so on, that, like, theologians have spoken of down the centuries even. So I don't think I mean, it seems to me that what psychedelics do is that they, alter the bodily system, especially the nervous system, the brain. And that then allows for new forms of sentience to emerge. I don't like the word emerge, to manifest, let's say. So breath work is one, so LSD is another, but they're not necessary causes. They're like, they're sufficient but not necessary causes in this case. And interestingly, it may be the case that these methods actually close down brain activity to some extent, which allows for increased sentience. That would be really interesting, because it would mean that the correlates of consciousness are not, the relation is not one of production or subvenience, but one of elimination. And that's something that I want to talk to David Nutt about, because interestingly, in the Imperial College, when they did imaging, brain imaging of psilocybin, the results were surprising, that they actually, in one region, they decreased brain activity, which was not expected.
Yeah.
But it would be expected from Bergsonian, Jamesian, Huxleyan point of view. And then I remember David Nutt in our conference video on the philosophy of psychedelics, he said, like, latest neurological research has shown that Huxley was right, James was right. Now, I wonder if he really understood what that really means, because that's quite a radical point of view, which is that the brain doesn't produce consciousness, rather it receives it. But this is what David Nutt explicitly said. You can see it. It's on philosophy of psychedelics.com. If you go to that website, you'll see him saying it in the welcome session. But me and him, we've spoken about writing a book together on this topic. So watch your space.
What part of the brain was that? Do you know what part of the brain it was that wasn't?
Was it the default mode network? I can't quite remember now. I think it was, yeah. But I can't remember the details.
Yeah. No, I think it's great that there's tests being done to see what is going on in the brain at the same time as that's happening, because it's just such a unexplained topic with so many going back to how much with David, how long ago they are and everything else. I feel like there's been a real downtime, or the 60s kind of changed quite a lot, because I think that kind of happened. And then I think also what we've just gone through with lockdown and everything else changed a lot. I think people got back a bit to more nature, because they could either go in the house, the garden, or the park. So
it's changed people's behavior a lot. People realize they don't need to work in offices and travel, and so on. So we're relocating, like for example, to my village here all the time.
We'll start a podcast in a shed.
Interesting about brain imaging, right?
Yeah.
So you brain image someone on 5-MeO DMT, and you see changes, average changes. Some people's brains act very differently to other people's brains, not always the same. It was taken average.
Yeah.
But what does that really tell you? So you
can read what's happening,
but what does it really explain? I mean, in many ways, that it doesn't need to be a full explanation. What it can do is it can show that, for example, it reduces activity related to depression, and so therefore that's good enough, right?
Yeah, of course.
As an antidepressant, that's good enough. It's like general anesthetics. People don't actually know how they work. Doesn't matter, right? It works, and that's all you need for clinical application. But from a philosophical point of view, of course, you want to know why that works. Why do general anesthetics? Why does psilocybin, 5-MeO DMT have these correlates? The correlates of consciousness. Neuroscience can only present the question. Like this brain state is correlated to this mental state. We don't know why. But that doesn't really matter for clinicians.
Yeah,
it matters for us.
And do you think, I mean, obviously that's a very you're looking at an MRI, or you're looking at something that's obviously showing brain pattern and everything else, but do you know of any sort of where people have tripped per se in a group, or where they've had the same experience? Because there's one I know with DMT where there's entities, or there's this is going far out, man, but it's where it's about I think they're elves or elvish elves, something like that, and that's something that many people discuss about the same the same thing happened to them, not exactly the same, but they are presented with very same imagery. There's a guy called Alex Gray who creates really amazing artwork around this, and a lot of people do say that is kind of what they see. The sound is very similar, like a woo kind of sound. Do you think if we got to a process of where people are getting into that state, that you can see that there is actually a realm, or is actually a place, that this is all kind of connected in that way? Do you think studies may go that way?
It's a very interesting question because, of course, if a number of people see the same thing, that sort of shows veridicality. I mean, it's what the same thing in real life, right? If only I see a cup, my friend doesn't. I'd question myself, you know.
Yeah.
But and there are, of course, very similar experiences, as you say, Lilliputians, little elves, and whatever.
Yeah.
And also like senses of unity, you know, of oneness.
Yeah.
However, it's complicated by a number of issues. For example, unity, right? This is very common in the West, and that's partly caused, I think, by influence from the East, you know, like especially Zen Buddhism, Satori, and things like this.
Yeah.
Suzuki, you know, came to the West in the mid 20th century and sort of introduced a form of Buddhism to Westerners that influenced Huxley, all those critical Huxley at one point. So we have these kind of Western Eastern forms of unity which seem to be the same. However, in American indigenous communities, this is not what reported, at least not widely, and if at all. I've spoken to this great anthropologist, he's now a friend of mine, Luis Eduardo Luna, who says this unity experience, really Western thing, you know. Well, but I, you know, Western Eastern, as I say. So that indicates there's this other interesting argument between perennialism on the one hand and contextualism on the other. So perennialism, which is epitomized by Aldous Huxley, really, is the view that all religions and all psychedelic experiences, at the highest level, you have the same experience of unity, right? The contextualists, and this was started by really a guy called Stephen Katz, Jewish scholar, a really good paper, very good critical paper, says, no, your experience itself is totally, completely conditioned by your culture.
Yeah.
So because like Westerners expect a unitive experience because of our theology and so on, then we will have it. Whereas in the Indias, they see snakes and jaguars as they would expect that. And so ultimately the question is, do psychedelics and so-called mystical experiences, are they conditioned by culture, or do they decondition a person from one's culture?
Yeah.
And you get good arguments for both cases. I mean, I'm kind of in the middle, because, you know, something like 5-MeO DMT, I'd be very surprised if it was different in different cultures. You know, it's so you wouldn't expect like cocaine or heroin to be culturally conditioned. You know, not ultimately, not in its essence of like you know, either pleasurable or excitation.
Yeah.
That's kind of you know, applies universally to humans at least. So I think the same with a number of psychedelics. But obviously, like when you have memories, for example, like lost memories in psychedelics, that is conditioned by your life and your culture, you know. So there must be an element of your environment which influences the experience you have. That can't be denied. But at the same time, to say that even these extreme experiences are completely culturally conditioned, I think it's false. And also, interestingly, like Bertrand Russell in his great essay called Mysticism and Logic, he says an element of the mystical experience is going beyond one's ideology, beyond good and evil, moral ideology. And the same with this Nobel laureate, Octavio Paz. He says psychedelics take one outside of one's culture, and it gives you a completely new perspective on yourself, and that's why it's good for therapy, but also on one's culture, because often one's mental health is related to one's culture, obviously, you know, if you're sort of, you know, always under pressure or something like this. I got a lot of sympathy for that as well. But then at the same, another interesting thing, which always confused me, is these like elves, as you say, and these Lilliputians. So you do get that, interestingly, in the American Indian cultures, you know. You get Shapiri, they're called, at least in one of the cultures. These tiny little animal or ancestral spirits that are, you know, the shaman can see as tiny little people. And then you also get it in the West, you know, not just after Terence McKenna spoke about machine elves, but way before that. I mean, study by Andrew Gallimore and David Luke, I think, showing that, you know, there's this, 100 years ago, people seeing little people. And I've seen it by myself, you know. I've got no particular interest. I've got no particular interest in little elves and goblins and stuff, but, you know, they do appear constantly strangely. I can never work it out. I
Are
just
they
don't know.
aggressive, or are they like they're just like
Always,
"Yo, what's
always
up?"
they've got a mischief. Well, they always got an element of mischief to them, you know. Slightly cheeky and you know, like jesters somehow. You know, it seems that way anyway.
Yeah,
Especially on Salvia Divinorum, Divinus Sage. They're sort of quite prevalent. So yeah, this is another one of these psychedelic mysteries. You know, you have to keep an open mind to these things.
yeah.
I don't know how to explain them.
There was a you know, not it's fiction, but it's a book, I think, Nine Perfect Strangers, a very mainstream show that just come out. Which was,
yeah, sorry.
Did you saw it? Yeah, and it was the connection between the anyone out there that haven't seen it. This is a spoiler alert, but it was the connection between obviously the son that died and that they all hallucinated at the same time to get through with the grief, and that's where I think I'm not sure if that can ever be medically proven or taken that far, but it's the link. That's what I found was so fascinating, that corresponded with the DMT, the elves, that there's something in this substance that brings up the same thing for everyone, and the fact that they're little machine elves is just crazy to me. But then can that be put through a connection between people with this substance that allows them, that they've all gone through the same experience, so that experience is in their subconscious in a different way? Can these substances actually bring that together? It's speculation, but it's just fascinating to see if that could be possible.
It's an interesting study. It's also related, of course, to what Jung calls possibly related to what Jung calls collective unconscious, which are these sort of figures in humanity's backlog of archetypes. And the jester, I believe, is one of them. Could it be related to this somehow? That depends on whether you accept Jung's whole kind of psychological, metaphysical setup, which is hard to prove in any way, but it's very interesting. So it just demands a lot more study. It'd be really interesting to do a study of, like what exactly do you mean by these little elves? Explain it in as much detail as possible, but not just in the West. Do it also in the East, and do it also in like Amerindian cultures. See the similarities and differences.
How do you examine your, after doing it in the right place and everything else? How do you examine the process you've gone through? Do you write straight after? Do you sort of just take some time to process, like a debrief, or?
I generally write down most things, experiences I have, but not always. Sometimes I just reflect on them, and sometimes I record, do an audio recording of my immediate sort of thoughts, because they're often lost, like a dream. If you don't write it down, same with psychedelics to a certain extent. And I've got even writings which became drawings of like psilocybin experiences from many years ago that are very interesting, like works of art in many ways, sort of text, like detailed, and then it sort of turns into spirals and mushrooms and so on. So all kinds of forms of recording. But I think it's quite interesting to record these things, especially if you're going to write about them later, which I do quite often. So for example, the 5-MeO one, I did do an audio recording of that, and then I wrote down a number of thoughts on it, and then eventually it turned into this chapter in this book coming out in a few months.
Okay, I've got one last question, and it's a bit of a selfish one. It's not really for my listeners, but if I, like some people, aspire to celebrities, I've always been fascinated by philosophers, and if I've always thought, like, for my process where I've gone through life, that it would be best for me to maybe do it in my 40s. So to study, to become a philosopher. What would you say is the best process? If I was a 40-year-old and I've done a podcast for 10 years, I'm 31 now, and I've spoken to some very, very different people over the 10 years on my study, would you say maybe start now and go through the process, or maybe...
well, it's very, very specific to your life situation. So I know you've done this podcast for a while, but
or just more against, I wasn't great at school, so more on the sense of where it would be good for someone who doesn't exactly have the best grades, but maybe an okay mind to go with philosophy and study in that kind of process in that realm, and then obviously learn a specific philosophy such as panpsychism, or
Gosh, well, I suppose, I mean, what draws more mature students is they've become really fascinated by one particular philosophical field, like panpsychism, maybe, and then they sort of read up on that, and then that then brings them. I mean, university gives you a good grounding in it, so then you would sort of, if you already had, I mean, the main thing really is to have a real, I hate the word passion, for certain subjects, because that then like forces you to study. It's not like a chore. If you see it as a chore, you've gone wrong already. It should sort of a real desire, curiosity to learn stuff. Get into that, and then through that you'll learn, over time, what these words mean, how these concepts relate to each other, and so on. After that, then if you were to do like a bachelor's degree in it, then that would be pretty easy, because you're already familiar with all these terms, and then you could specialize thereafter. You could specialize with a master's in a more specific topic, which would be the one, I guess, that brought you in it, and then But it's it's a long process. I mean, it's
I've got time.
Yeah, so you just need time, and you need passion, and you need to also think about, especially, how to be able to convey your thoughts in terms of writing, mostly. So like you need to look at essay writing skills, and when you come across a good writer, think to yourself, make notes. Why is this person a good writer? How do they differ from what I consider to be bad writers, and then try to emulate that. And question everything. Don't take anything for granted. This is how Schopenhauer said, this is how philosophy is different from all other subjects. You can't assume anything. With science, you assume the methodology, and you assume certain basic metaphysical things, and philosophy can't do that. Everything's up for grabs. Even that which I've just said. So get ready for paradox, and Brilliant. And it's kind of frustrating. It's usually more questions than answers as well.
Yes. I mean, one of my favorite philosophers is Alan Watts, and the way I run and listen to a lot of Alan Watts, like sort of chill step and stuff like that. I've even got a tortoise called Alan Watts, and his dictionary, I just find there's such a flow to it. It's so eloquent and amazing to listen to, and the way he can put things across in humor, I think, is great. I mean, the only thing I'm doing that's anything slightly close to starting this process is I do solo podcasts. So I write and then kind of go down a process of what that is. I've just done one on presence, so being presence, stuff like that. So I'm starting, but yes.
Yeah, well, Alan Watts, I think he's especially good at analogies, metaphors.
Of course, yeah. Putting the point across.
Yeah, both Alan Watts and Terence McKenna are very much influenced by Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher.
Yeah.
So you might want to start looking at
I'm definitely going to go further back in a way.
Start with a book called Modes of Thought, one of his later books, which is a good one to start with, and it's really fascinating, and it's got panpsychism in it and a number of other elements. But Whitehead, he was kind of a bit neglected in the 20th century. He's becoming more popular now. So it's a good one to sort of get into now as you get more. Another thing about studying at university, you have to find the right lecturers who are interested in the same things as you.
That's what I think. You have to kind of aspire to the teachers that are there, or obviously click in some sort of way. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been extremely educational, and I feel like I've gone on a DMT trip, and I'll probably listen to this and try and process a lot of what you said today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's been real pleasure.
No worries. Will you be at How the Light Gets In next year as well, or if it's on, if whatever's going on with the year?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, there's the next one's in Wales, isn't it?
Oh, okay.
And, I have been asked if I'm interested in that. I have tentatively said I am interested. So,
okay. Well, I'll message you on Instagram, see if you're there and whatever. All right. Well, thank you so much, and have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
You too.
Bye. But everyone's going to have really weird dreams tonight about machine elves running around being little devils that they are. Who knows? But as I said at the beginning, that was a fantastic episode, and just want to thank Peter for his time, really, and I hope to get to talk to him another time. And we might bump into each other at the festival, How the Light Gets In, which is a really good festival. If you like these kind of podcasts and you like talks which are a bit out of the box and people trying to think a bit more than they usually do at festivals, it's a really good one to go, and it's in Wales coming up. And as I said, I'll leave all the links for Peter's information on YouTube and any of the platforms you might be listening to. All the links will be provided below if you want to do some further research on his work and on psychedelics and how they might change the world and help all of us, rather than being the scary thing that we've been told. But yeah, small part just now where I ask you for those little things that you can do for me, and that would be just signing up to that Patreon. That would be so amazing. There's like 500 downloads in the last week, 2,000 people watching on the YouTube channel. So the subscriptions obviously are looking about 10% of you. So I love you lot and I love all of you, but it would be great to just, not keep having to say it all the time like I'm begging, but at the same time I am maybe a little bit begging. But yeah, it just helped me out, and you get a free mug which actually costs around $4.60. I think, I don't even want to look at the cost too much because it's going to take a few months to get that back, but it's a great mug. And yeah, I'm glad this one's done, and moving on to the next one. The next one will be a solo podcast, and then I've got another 2 guests. I've got some people coming to the shed this month, some Christmas specials, some more comedy, because I think after psychedelics, philosophy of the mind, flat earth, mind you, in this one and the flat earth, there was a lot of comedy as well. I think there's a lot of laughter anyway. I like to take it with a bit more of a lighter tone around these hard-hitting subjects that some people find, but there will be a bit more, shall we say, chatting shit, and mates coming over, and the regulars I'm trying to get to come on a weekly or 2 weekly basis, so we get some familiar faces and we all grow together. So enjoy the rest of your week, and thank you again for listening.
It's like they've really spun a web. Our consciousness
I can't describe how it is.
is slightly false
To me, it's a slightly darker version,
because there is a
but I could look into my
collective consciousness.
imagination.
Truth is what real reality is based on.
Art in art as well.
All my crazy.
Your art is there.
Just because you say it's like that doesn't mean I'm going to read it like that.
They still don't know where consciousness is. So when I'm meditating, yeah, I bet you do.
It's basically your heart.
Really?
Yeah.